Hello again. Okay, so for this video, we're going to be looking at the Jewish role as well as like other national minorities roles in the Soviet secret police. This will cover a couple different organizations throughout the decades, mainly going to be looking from the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution to Stalin's death. So that covers the Cheka, the OGPU, the NKVD, also the MGB, the later time period around Stalin's death. I'm just gonna be looking at the like basic like Wikipedia timelines and like definitions for these organizations. It's kind of confusing when you read the literature because sometimes they're like used concurrently with each other. So I think that these organizations existed in different stages, like at different times, and kind of blended in together. But for the sake of like clarity, I'm just gonna like treat them as each beginning and ending at definitive times, and we're just gonna look at each kind of organization and time period separately. Even before the Cheka was established, there was always secret police in Russia. So the Tsar had their own secret police called the Okhrana. The difference is like the Soviet secret police killed way more people and like tortured way more people, but the idea that there's just always been like some kind of secret police and secret security force in Tsarist Russia, and that led into the secret police that we see in the Soviet Union. So there's just a link there. But before we even go into the Cheka organization, I want to bring your attention to a group that were known as the kind of like the backbone of the Cheka, and even the Chekists, known as the Chekists before the Cheka even existed, and that would be the Latvian riflemen who came and assisted Lenin and the Bolsheviks during the revolution and during the Civil War. I'm pointing this group out because they were probably the biggest group and certainly the most disproportionate group in the Cheka during the Civil War period, and I don't think they're really talked about a lot. You can read the book, The Latvian Impact on the Bolshevik Revolution, for more information on that. But essentially, the Latvian Bolshevik party in Latvia itself actually achieved a Bolshevik revolution before the October Revolution in Russia, and they had their own Soviet republic a little bit before the USSR was even founded, called the Iskalat Republic. So after the Iskalat Republic was established, Latvian riflemen known as the Strelki were sent over to the USSR to help with like the security and fighting in the major cities of the revolution. And from the book, you can see the specific role that the Latvian riflemen fulfilled during the revolution. And Lenin numerous times portrayed the Latvians as kind of like a vanguard of the vanguard, like a true revolutionary people. And he just praised them a lot and worked with them like in between 1905 and 1917. So that's good background information to know. And the Cheka was created in late 1917. And the first leader of the Cheka was Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was an ethnic Pole. But two of his main lieutenants were Latvians, Peters and Lotzis. There were other lieutenants that were close to Dzerzhinsky as well. Unschlicht, who was Jewish, Menjinsky, who was a Pole like Dzerzhinsky, and he actually ended up leading the OGPU later on. And then we also see Moises Ritsky, who was Jewish. It's pretty obvious by the name. But he was actually assassinated by another Jewish guy. I forget his name. I think Leonid Kassinger. And he was assassinated around the same time that Lenin had an assassination attempt put on his life by Fanny Kaplan, another who was also a Jewish girl. And the reason that these two Jewish people tried to assassinate Bolshevik leaders was they were part of like the Jewish socialist movement, the Jewish Bund, like anarchists, so they didn't like the Bolshevik like way of going about doing things. It's just interesting to know. And then after these assassinations and attempts, that's when the Cheka like Red Terror really kicked into gear. Also forgot to mention that after Uritsky was assassinated, Gleb Boki, who was an ethnic Russian, replaced him, and he played a significant part in the Red Terror. And weirdly enough, at least from his Wikipedia article, it says he was involved in like tantric studies and theosophical stuff, so like esoteric stuff, I guess. I don't really know much about that, but it's kind of weird. But anyway, moving on. And by the end of the Civil War, like tens of thousands, if not like over 100,000 people died like directly at the hands of the Cheka. But honestly, during the whole Russian Civil War, like millions of people died, like I think like around 10 million. So, it's all kind of relative, but yeah, it's definitely like a lot of violence. But we can look more at the like top Cheka lieutenants and members of the Collegium. We can see here, this table shows that there was 5 Jews, 3 Lets, or Latvians, and the rest were like a mix of like other nationalities and Russians. I mean, Russians are mainly like always the majority, obviously. Even though, again, like I said in the previous video, Russians weren't necessarily like a huge majority in the Tsarist Russian Empire. They were actually like in overall statistics like a minority, but just like the largest minority, like roughly I think like 44% or something. And that might have changed once like the USSR, like after its land loss and like emigration, it might have increased. But anyway, that's not important. And we see a Trotsky quote kind of outlining his concern over the disproportionate amount of Jews and Latvians in the security force as well. So it was a known thing at the time that both groups were disproportionate. I would argue for the Cheka, at least, the Latvians were way more disproportionate than Jews. That definitely changes later on, and we're going to see that in the video. But I think it's pretty safe to say that the Cheka were like more of a Latvian thing, at least during the Civil War period. In this article about the Latvian role, it talks about how the central Cheka in Moscow, there was 278 Let workers out of 781 total, and then 38 out of the 70 commissars of the Cheka were Latvian. We see the same numbers in Oleg Budnickij's book, Russian Jews Between Reds and Whites, which I've cited from before. And from the same amount of workers, the 781 workers in Moscow, only 29 were Jews and 49 Poles. So Jews were roughly 3.7%. He lists among the senior officials of the Cheka, there were 119 Latvians, 19 Poles, 19 Jews, which is 8.6%. The same 38 out of 70 commissars were Latvian, and only 3 Jews, so 4%. But once you start getting into interrogators, you do see like a slightly higher, not slightly higher, but just like higher rate of Jews among the interrogators. So 19.1% among the 42 interrogators and deputy interrogators. I think he has like a typo here because he later on says 7. He like lists Jews twice. I think he meant Poles in that one. And then also this is something I see like cited a lot by like far right people, is that in the section for combating counter-revolution, 6 out of the 12 interrogators were Jews, so that's 50%. But I mean, again, that's like still talking about like a small number of people. That's like 6 people, and I'm not saying they weren't important, but overall, like workers and like high-ranking officials, I wouldn't say Jews were like super overrepresented, more than they are in like other aspects of the party. And Oleg in his book talks about that it was basically the same proportions in the party as a whole. And the reason why interrogators, there's one theory that like a decent amount or like a disproportionate amount were Jewish is because you needed to be like really good with languages and like be more educated to be an interrogator rather than just like other just like a general worker for the Cheka, like just like a soldier or something, like security, like straight up security. If you wanted to be like an actual interrogator and like do like information digging and stuff like that, you just needed like more education and more like skill with languages, especially considering a lot of Latvians like didn't know Russian. I mean, they spoke their own language. But there is this mistaken notion that like, oh, Jews joined the Cheka as like for revenge on the pogroms and stuff. But the thing about this is that the Civil War was going on like when the Cheka were active, so there wasn't enough time for like the Jews who were affected by pogroms to necessarily go and join the Cheka after being like, you know, had their families pogromed against. You could make that argument maybe later on for the NKVD, but I think for the Cheka, it was too early on. The war was still going, like ongoing and stuff, and the urbanization and migration hadn't really, like it was starting to happen, but it hadn't settled in yet. And that's what, again, Oleg Budnickij talks about in his other article. It's all in German. I use Google Translate, and you can buy the article for like a couple bucks or whatever. But he just gives like more stats. It's just titled like the Jews and the Cheka, but in German, obviously. So I have to use Google Translate for that. But he discusses the same numbers listed in his book, Russian Jews Between Reds and Whites, and just talks about how the Cheka, like, they were equal opportunists. They targeted Jews, obviously non-Jews, that they weren't, like, super educated, that, like, the majority of Cheka weren't, you know, didn't have, like, university education, because most people in general just weren't university educated at the time. A lot of people just joined for monetary gain and benefit. So there, he just like dismisses the notion that there was like any kind of revenge reason for joining the Cheka, which makes sense because I mean most of the worst parts of the conflict like were happening at this time, so it's not like people could necessarily like react, join the Cheka real quickly. Like there had to be some time to like settle in, I guess, for lack of a better word. And he also talks about how essentially it was the group of four, quote unquote, who practically led the Cheka, and that would be Dzerzhinsky, Peters, Lotsis, and Ivan Kisenofontev. I don't know how to pronounce that, but he was an ethnic Russian, or Wiki says he's from like an ethnic Greek family, but whatever. He was Russian, like spoke Russian and stuff. So he lists those people as like the top Cheka people. So anyway, that's who he points to as the top like four leaders, and however you want to count it. I mean, ultimately the leader was Dzerzhinsky, so and he was an ethnic Pole. So there you go for that. Okay, so moving on to the post-Civil War period, basically the 20s up until like the early 30s, we have the OGPU. The Cheka is disbanded. We have Felix Dzerzhinsky still leading the organization up until his death in the mid 20s, and then we have Menjinsky who replaces him, so another ethnic Pole. We see a pretty similar ethnic breakdown with the majority of central apparatus workers of the OGPU being Russian, then Let, then Jewish, and then Polish, and that's similar for like the entire like employee breakdown. It's kind of hard sometimes looking at all the different like ways they count statistics. Anyway, so there's there's still disproportionate Latvian and Jewish and Polish, but the majority are Russian. And we get that from this French article I'm going to post. Again, you need to use Google Translate, but this article is free online, so it's pretty easy to use Google Translate on it. And during this time, we see actions against religious organizations and institutions, like demolishing churches and like confiscating religious texts and all that stuff. Jews were definitely affected by this. There's kind of this like notion that Jews were like somehow exempt from this kind of stuff, but that's totally not true. Zionist organizations were definitely stamped on. They were seen as like nationalistic, reactionary types. The Jewish religion was like not respected. And I'm not saying it was like worse than what Christians went through. Like obviously the Orthodox Christian church like was the main victim of the religious persecutions, but like every religious community like was persecuted. Like the Bolsheviks were an atheistic party, like they did not like religion. They thought it was reactionary. So yeah, they were against that. So Zionists and religious Jews were targeted, oftentimes by Jewish people, like by the Yevzetskia, but also like the secret police. Other like secret police actions were followed and stuff, but we don't see like really big like headline stuff, I guess you'd say, until the dekulakization order that Stalin passes in 1930. And the whole dekulak ideology and collectivization ideology that leads to the Holodomor in 1933, and like the famines in Ukraine. And there were actually famines like all across Russia at the time, and most people blame that on the collectivization policies of the Bolshevik Party, the 5-year plan that Stalin wanted to implement to like rapidly industrialize and like collectivize the nation. So anyway, Stalin was definitely like the leader of that and wanted to push that. So I guess for this section, I do want to talk mainly about the Holodomor and the start of the Gulag system. So in terms of the collectivization of agriculture and dekulakization, this was decided upon in the Politburo led by Stalin. And Stalin sent out Molotov and Kagnovich, Molotov being Russian and Kagnovich being Jewish. Molotov from the famous Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And from my research, I couldn't really tell, like, if anything, it seemed like Molotov was the second in command after Stalin in this regard. But also it seemed like Molotov and Kagnovich were kind of on equal footing, so you can just, for all intents and purposes, consider them to be, like, kind of equal. And a good thing to look at in terms of, like, responsibility for the Holodomor, I don't really know how to pronounce it, is a Ukrainian court, like, recently and not too long ago, indicted 6, like, deceased people as guilty of genocide. And the whole genocide question of was the Holodomor like an intentional genocide or not, that gets into like historical debate and like intentionality. Like people aren't sure if it's an intentional genocide or if it's just like bad, poor central planning which led to famine. But regardless of whether you think it's a genocide or not, the court found 7 people guilty of genocide, including Stalin, Kagnovich, Molotov, Pavel Postashev, who was an ethnic Russian, and then 3 people who were in the Ukrainian wing of the Communist Party Stanislav Kosior, Vlas Chibar, and Mendel Katayevich. And Mendel was Jewish Ukrainian, the other two were just Ukrainian. But these last three actually sent out like notices and like telegrams or letters saying that like, oh, like we cannot meet this grain quota, and it's like the collectivization efforts aren't working, and it's like resulting in famine and stuff. And Stalin like was aware of these warnings and like totally dismissed them, and he like sent letters and telegrams back directed at Molotov and Kagnovich, like just saying to like ignore them and just keep on with the 5-year plan. So it's pretty clear that like Stalin was like the main guy. I mean, obviously everyone knows that Stalin was like the dictator, and he was the main, like if he wanted to call it off, he could have called it off. So whoever you want to blame, I mean, obviously Stalin has the most blame, and then even looking at other people, it's like a pretty mixed bag of people. And then on to the Gulag administration. The first Gulag head was actually a Latvian named Fedor Imans, so he was the first head, but he was only the head for a short amount of time. And then the next three were Jewish, like there's no denying that. You have Kogan, Berman, Pleiner. But after Pleiner, you actually see like it's basically all like ethnic Russians or people from other ethnicities up until like the mid-50s. And there also is this notion that like the Gulag system was only really bad during like the early 30s, or only really bad during the Great Purges, like in the later 30s. But if you actually go by numbers, it was like probably the worst, like just going off numbers, like during the World War II and post World War II periods. Another person I should mention is Vsevolod Belitsky. Don't know how to pronounce that. And he actually directed the secret police of Ukraine, like he didn't lead the secret police in general, like that general head, but he was the leader of the Ukrainian faction of it during the Great Famine. So he actually was like pretty instrumental in that as well. But I should mention that Menjinsky at this time was pretty sick, and Genrikh Yagoda, who people hear about a lot, people see like a lot of memes of him. But Yagoda was actually the head of the OGPU, which later turned into the NKVD during this time. So he obviously like definitely has some part of the blame too. But again, the whole reason I'm doing this is because people don't look at like the whole grand scheme of things. They only like focus in on like the Jewish people. So I'm just trying to like show that it was more broad than that. And speaking of Yagoda, he like famously had the White Sea Baltic Canal project, which cost like 10 to 20,000 lives of workers. Interestingly enough, that was another thing that Stalin wanted to push through with forced labor, like prison labor from gulags, and he wanted it like in a really tightly fit schedule. And Yagoda actually like pushed back on that a bit and like said that they should be treated like well, because if they weren't treated well, they weren't gonna like achieve the project in time, and like it wasn't gonna work out. I'm not saying he's like a good person for that. Like obviously he was a bad person, but I'm just saying that like again and again you see Stalin kind of pushing to the limits and beyond like all these projects and things where people on the ground are telling him otherwise. So again, if you want to blame someone, like blame Stalin. Like he should get most of the blame, like honestly, but neither here nor there. Naftali Frankel worked with Yagoda and was instrumental in like the creation and like leadership of the Gulag. I believe Solzhenitsyn talks about Frankel a bit in his book 200 Years Together, or no, Gulag Archipelago. Interestingly enough, Solzhenitsyn was actually in a Gulag during the post-World War II period, where the Gulag system and the NKVD, which later turned into the MGB, was way more Russified. It was basically a Russian faction, or a Russian-led thing, and like only Russian workers by the like late 30s, early 40s, moving onward. And for the Gulag in particular, I mean, you have to look at each Gulag camp to see like who led it and like how they led it and stuff. Again, there's this notion that the Gulags were like death camps. I would not like classify them as death camps. If you look at the death rate, obviously they were really terrible like prison labor camps, and like a lot of bad shit happened. But if you're just gonna like be nitpicky about terms, I would just say prison labor camps rather than like death camps. And it really depended which one you were at and who it was led by. For example, Edward Berzin set up labor camps in Kolyma, Siberia, which was considered one of the more brutal Gulag centers. He was a Latvian, but even he wasn't just some like sadistic dude who like killed everyone and like, oh, human life was worthless. But it was very basically like the project and like the building and stuff, like all the material wants of the Soviet Union were placed on a higher pedestal than human life. Like if humans had to die to achieve what they wanted, like they were fine with that. But they didn't necessarily just want to like kill everyone. So that's why like I refrain from calling them death camps. You can call them slave labor camps for sure, and where there was torture and murder, but you can just look at the death rates. You can look at Anne Applebaum's book, Gulag. But yeah, anyway, pretty safe to say that Like Jews definitely played a pretty big role in the Gulag system and in the NKVD in general in the 30s. We see like the numbers in certain tables from the French article, but I mean, you can look this up anywhere, where the Jewish overrepresentation in the higher echelons of the NKVD is like totally undeniable. They are like the biggest minority, or no, they're the biggest group. Not the majority ever, but they're still like the single biggest, if that makes sense, whatever. You can just look at the table. But this number starts to go down with the Great Terror. Nikolai Yezhov, or the Great Purge, whatever you want to call it, led by Nikolai Yezhov, who became NKVD head after Yagoda. And Yagoda was eventually purged and like put to death under the Great Purges. You start to see basically how I would describe the Great Purge is like a general Russification of the whole security and military apparatus of the Soviet Union. So you start to see the Jewish numbers go down, Latvian numbers go down, basically all minority numbers go down. And so by the late 30s, early 40s, I would say it's pretty much proportional. So yeah, you can see the Jewish numbers and all other minority numbers go down, except Ukrainian, but Ukrainians are a big minority. So by the late 30s, early 40s, the numbers are basically proportional. And if you looked more on, like, you wouldn't even see, like, you basically see, like, no Jewish numbers or Latvian numbers in the NKVD or military. And most people point to, like, prepping for war as the, and just, like, Stalin's paranoia over Trotsky and stuff, chalk it up to, like, Russification and just trying to prepare basically for the war that he knew he was going to get into with Hitler. And here's another table too, just showing like in general the workers, like not just the upper echelons. And Jews obviously weren't as disproportional in that, and they decreased over time as well. You can see this in the Gulag administrators that I showed you before. Basically all were ethnic Russian. Leaders of the NKVD. After Yezhov, it was Beria, who was Georgian, but after him I think it was all ethnic Russians. You could see during the World War II period that the Gulag death rates go like way up. Obviously that's because there's a war going on, but still it's like a pretty big thing. The overall numbers go up, and post World War II is like actually its height in terms of like numbers. A lot of former prisoners of war that came back to the Soviet Union were like put into camps because they just weren't trusted. There was like mass deportations of various ethnic groups, persecution of various ethnic groups, including Jews, like the Doctor's Plot, and like Stalin had plans to like deport all the Jews from the cities apparently. So yeah, the post like World War II, post World War II, NKVD, which later turned into the MGB, and the Gulag system was definitely still like underway. Solzhenitsyn even complains about this. Like he has a complaint that like, oh, like people always think about the Great Purge era, but it was happening before and after. So there was always this basically like always bad shit going on. And post World War II is actually when you see some of the worst stuff in terms of like deportations and Gulag deaths and slave labor and stuff. So basically, to summarize, if you look at the Jewish role, I would say it peaked in the 30s in the NKVD and the Gulag system. It was not super overrepresented in the Cheka period and the OGPU period until later. And then it dropped off with the Great Purges and was not really present at all in the World War II, post-World War II era. It's kind of like in my last video how there were overrepresentation in the early years, like 20s, mid-20s in the Central Committee and Politburo, but that fell off and like never really recovered. Same thing here. It just happened a bit later, but then fell off, never recovered. Just kind of wanted to show like the breadth of people involved, like different ethnicities, whatever. There's no denying like the Jewish role in a lot of it, but I mean, the whole point of this channel is to show like it's not just like the JQ. It's like, I mean, it's more complicated than just that. So yeah, but I hope you liked the video, and I'll put sources in the description. Thanks.